Welcome to the Bad Boss Brief, a strategic guide on how to not be an asshole at work. We'll tell you about bad bosses, how they can be handled, how to tell if you happen to be one. An executive and an executive coach, both artists working in advertising and marketing for more than 2 decades, are here to advise you on the ins and outs of office environments. The Bad Boss Brief is your ultimate guide to navigating any employment landscape. Without any further ado, here are your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo.
Okay.
There we go.
There we go. I'm Stephanie Peirolo.
I'm Eugene S. Robinson.
And welcome to the Bad Boss Brief. Today, we are going to talk about the gaslighting boss, which means we're going to be talking about Greg Becker, the CEO, or I guess former CEO of the former Silicon Valley Bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The guy who's responsible for all these nice jets over at Moffett Field and very upset people. I mean, it's not even kidding. When somebody like Charles Schwab loses billions of dollars in a day, you're lucky to still be alive, I imagine.
So are you seeing planes come into Moffett Field?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I drove by today on my way to my accountant and saw them on the tarmac. That's not an airport that people really use. It's a former military base. So I'm imagining that this is going to be a big deal, as well as was it First Financial as well? It's like, yeah, we're kind of unstable. And then, of course, the big news is Credit Suisse and UBS today. So it's like, what did you think? Did you think it was like Andy Griffith?
Yeah.
There's a little lady, Aunt B, behind the desk with your money?
No. Well, and what's interesting is, the origin of the word gaslight comes from a movie called Gaslight by Alfred Hitchcock.
Great movie.
In the movie, a man marries a woman and yes, tries to get her money by convincing her that things are happening that aren't actually happening. So he is trying to spin her perception of reality to his advantage for, not surprisingly, financial gain. So that's why we wanted to talk about the gaslighting boss. And we're going to do two things. We're going to talk about Greg Becker at SVB and what that can teach us as leaders or people who pay attention to leadership. And then we are going to have a section at the end where we're going to talk about what to do if you work for a gaslighting boss. Because there are plenty of people who feel like they're being gaslighted by their bosses. I hear from them and aren't quite sure what to do. So we're going to do both of those things. But let's go ahead and start with our friend, Greg Becker, the CEO at SVB. Yeah. So there were a couple things, and the quotes and facts that I'm going to be talking about come from the New York Times. There was a really good article by Maureen Farrell called "Inside the Collapse of Silicon Valley Bank." And an interesting fact about him is that aside from 1 year after he graduated from college, he spent his entire career at SVB. The entire career. This means he had no exposure to other ways of leading, other corporate cultures, and he became completely enmeshed with the understanding. He became Silicon Valley Bank. And I think that's warning sign number one is, people who are in leadership positions who have only ever been at one place really risk a lack of perspective and a lack of knowledge. They talk about it as a badge of loyalty. I actually think it's a liability. What do you think?
The weird thing is Silicon Valley has gone through like different peregrinations connected to how long you should be at a job. Like when I first started in the Valley, if you were at a company more than 2 or 3 years and there didn't seem to be obvious growth in your like you went from, I started as an associate editor and now I'm senior editor. If that wasn't, then people were kind of like, it was such a go-go time. There'd be like, there's something wrong with you. Okay. So flash forward about 15, 20 years to where companies are now established. Now what they're looking for is loyalty. Now if they look at your resume and you've been at every company for 3 years, they're like, this person has a problem committing. They don't understand how to team play, all these kind of shibboleths that are connected to it. So then you start to say, oh, okay, I'm going to stay at a company for 10 years. And so it's back and forth. It's like the weirdest kind of dating dance, trying to figure out where the sweet spot is for how long you should be at a company and what kind of experience that affords you. But yeah, in my mind, it's always a red flag if somebody has never been anywhere else. I mean,
Well, and
Yeah.
especially, I mean, I think the other red flag is I don't know what happened to him. I can't know what went on in his brain. I don't know if
Mhm.
he believed his own press or if he actually was lying or if it was some sort of amalgam of the two. But I think one of the warning signs is that he became synonymous with Silicon Valley Bank. In fact,
Yeah.
one of the people that was quoted in one of those articles talked about it as the Church of Greg.
Mhm.
And so he became completely representative. And I think he might it might just be hubris. Like he might
Mhm.
actually believe this because one of the things that he talked a lot about innovation and
Mhm.
knowing marketing, knowing public relations. My guess is that at some point they had a work session and decided, hey, let's have Greg's message be all about innovation and let's
Mhm.
portray him as the person leading the charge and standing out in front. And at some point he really believed that.
Okay, so right, so we could easily kind of pile this on Greg's narrow shoulders, but the reality of it is he had enablers aplenty. People who pushed through Christian cinema in Arizona, who pushed through this deregulation and received a lot of money for pushing it through this deregulation that has gotten them into the trouble that they are now. I mean, this is yeah, he it's now Monday morning quarterbacking to look at him and go, well, he really screwed up. But he had lots of people who helped him. Yeah, no, here's a slippery slide to hell. Oh, cool. And here's a bunch of TNT. Oh, cool. I'll be able to handle this. And he clearly wasn't. And once again, we're stuck in a place where people, should we regulate banks or should we not regulate banks? And the government has said, well, we're not going to bail you guys out again. So they're selling assets now, which I think maybe had something to do with all those jets at Moffett. So Greg is. I mean, he should have understood that he was now part of a unhealthy system. Because like if there's enough blame to be spread, it doesn't mean that things were. He's less responsible, but the whole system it wasn't really working, and that, like you say, it was a first warning sign. Should have been to everybody involved.
Yeah, and I think and I agree that it's certainly not all on his shoulders, but I do think that it is a warning sign when there is a leader, charismatic leaders like we've talked about before, who
Mhm,
represents an organization, right?
mhm.
You then that person becomes too big to fail, right?
Yeah,
And we've seen this, and
right.
I think in a way there are traditional leadership coaches, marketing people, PR people who are like the CEO should be the forward facing
Mhm,
entity to the world. And there, at least what I've seen is people are really fostering that kind of the leader who's out in front, the one who talks about, in this case, innovation. And I think the challenge is that then, that puts so much onto the leader's shoulders. So when he makes a
mhm.
simple mistake, like, saying something untoward, it can have huge repercussions for him.
Right, right.
And I think that's part of the challenge. And I think the other thing that is systemic is he focused so much on the vision, they forgot to do just the basics of banking. And
Yeah.
I think that's something to pay attention to too. So, they at banks, because they
Mhm.
need to focus on risk management, they have something called a chief risk officer. So Silicon Valley Bank's chief risk officer
I need one of those
retired.
for my personal life.
Yes, yes, I think you could.
Yeah.
So she retired in April of 2022.
Okay.
April. They
Okay.
did not hire a replacement chief risk officer until the end of December 2022.
Uh-huh.
So 8 months, they did
Mhm.
not have a person who was leading what one would think is the critical function of a bank. And I think what happened is that somehow it's like Silicon Valley Bank became about innovation and they
Mhm.
forgot that they were a bank. They forgot that they had to have like competent risk management. And I think that's one of the challenges that can happen when you have that sort of special, charismatic, innovative leader boss is that people forget what they're actually doing.
Mhm. I had one of my lifetime terrible bosses said in the midst of a presentation that he had done when he was at Goldman Sachs, the guy he was presenting to just started waving his hands and said, "Listen," and because of course this is the way they talk to each other at Goldman Sachs. Either you fucking think I'm stupid or you're stupid. Your rosy projections mean nothing. And in essence, this guy had dressed him down for not including, a risk portion of his SWOT analysis. Where are your threats? Where are your weaknesses? There's nothing like that in here. Why are you wasting my time? And in that crucial 8 months, clearly somebody who had paid attention to those portions of the SWOT analysis, weaknesses and threats would have been well suited to get Greg's ear for 5 or 10 minutes, maybe.
Well, and it's like that the Emperor's New Clothes,
Right.
right? I mean, the whole reason that the Emperor and all of his henchmen continue with the idea that these are actual clothes is that they don't want to look stupid.
Yeah, right.
Because that's what the swindlers say. If you can't see this cloth, then you're dumb. And nobody wants to appear to be dumb. And I think that's a lot of what's going on here. But then, like you said, there is the larger systemic issue. So Becker in 2015 told the Senate Banking Committee that if financial regulations weren't lifted, right, if they had to stay regulated like they were previously, banks his size would, quote, likely will need to divert significant resources from providing financing to job creative companies in the innovation economy to complying with enhanced prudential standards and other requirements. In other words, this will be inconvenient because it will make me be a bank.
That's going to come back. That's going to come back out of, like it's already come back out of. That's great. That's great. Period. Close quote. Thank you, Greg.
Right.
Wow.
And I think that's another, it's a warning sign. And we see this so many times, right? That these leaders want regulation. They want to be free. Look at what we're doing. We're creating jobs. Why should we have to pay taxes, submit to regulation, what have you? But then when things go bad, then they want to be regulated. Like the first thing was, we're FDIC insured. So everybody's insured up to $250,000, except then they weren't. And you're right. It is part of a larger systemic situation. And I mean, this happened under the Trump administration. And yet how, and these libertarian pundits are now saying, well, there actually should be some regulation because banks are like it's important because if they go down, then it's problematic.
Well, also they haven't factored into. I had a friend who in a divorce proceeding got $7 million. Didn't see her for a while. Then at one point was in the parking lot to some greasy spoon in Sunnyvale. And she's there. I go, hey, how are things going? Great. What are you doing here? You eating here? Is food any good? She goes, I'm working here. Working? What happened to the 7 mil? It's gone. It's gone. What do you mean gone? Gone. Yeah, well, let's see. You got a condo out of it. You got a Lexus and bought a Jeep for your daughter. What happened to the rest of it? Gone. So when these banks go under, people, it's not like, like you're overdrawn on your credit card. Maybe you wait a few weeks, you could pay it off. No, it's gone. Doesn't exist anymore. Not to be had. Not like if I hold on, I lost some value in the stock. If I hold on to it, it'll go up in value. None of that. Gone. Like jump off the building in 1929. Gone. So to find Elon Musk wading into it with advice, it chilled me to my core. He is not my subject for Fire Me this week. However, I found that to be chilling because when these things go, they go. That's why people were jumping off of buildings in 1929. It wasn't because their prospects were low. It was because everything was gone.
Well, and I think this comes back to the fungible notion of what constitutes the public square.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So now banks are impacting the economy and the stock market globally. Right. So suddenly now banks are in the public square. Banks should be regulated like securities. Banks should be regulated like water or electricity now. Right. And yet in the middle of the Trump administration, when these deregulation was passed, it was like, well, mid-sized banks won't really have any big impact on the economy. Yeah. We just need to be able to regulate and stress test the big banks that are too big to fail, because we saw what happened in 2008 when those failed. But the idea is like, and I think that's the challenge that we face is there's this tension between what should be public and what should be private, what should be regulated and what should not be regulated. And too often people are like, well, regulation is going to negatively impact the economy, right? That's what Becker said in front of the Senate Banking Committee. I won't be able to give loans, which means companies won't be able to hire people and the economy will be damaged by the inability to hire more people. Not seeing the other side of deregulation, which is look at the economic damage that has happened in the last few weeks.
All right.
because of this
Right.
one bank failing. And I think that there's not, it's a little bit like, I don't know, like any sort of infrastructure that you look at, if you don't
Mhm.
invest in the infrastructure, it's going to be problematic. Like there are lots of infrastructure things that we should be investing in right now that we're not, and people are going to start shouting when the bridges collapse. This is the bridge collapse.
So now, so in your estimation, is Becker, is he, who is gaslighting whom in this instance? Because if he is tricking himself, then he's almost blameless. Like if he believes his own lies. I mean, if Ray Milland in the movie Gaslight actually believed that the lights were changing, then you have like two crazy people, and it's a very different story. So is there an owner operator who is conscious of the fact that they are selling wolf tickets here, or or is he, has he been drinking Kool-Aid and maybe just a little bit too much? I mean, and I'm not looking for exoneration for Greg Becker necessarily, but I'm trying to figure like what you think his frame of mind is.
I mean, my guess is that he's probably somewhere in between, right? That there's something self-serving. He recognizes that it will benefit his bank if there is, say, deregulation, right?
Hmm.
And he believes the talking points that were no doubt given to him by somebody else
Hmm. Hmm.
about, or job creation or whatever. I think that he is culpable. And I think he's
Hmm.
culpable and I think that the system is also culpable. But like, so for example, if I'm looking at it in the street in front of my house. If someone was running down the street with a machete,
Hmm.
he may or may not intend to do harm, but I would definitely want him to be restrained in some way, right? And the legal system says
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
you can't run down the street wielding a machete without having some consequences. And I think the challenge is that there are people like Becker who are running around with a machete and you're not sure what they're going to be cutting or what it is that's going to be damaged. And there's no system in place to identify them as a threat and remove them
Hmm.
until they've
Hmm.
actually,
Hmm.
hurt things, hurt people.
Right.
And I think that's the
It's
challenge.
it's funny you should mention it. A guy walks into where I do jujitsu, and apparently he had a machete. So he walks up to the front desk. He wasn't brandishing it; it was stuck. He had a sling and it was stuck over his back. And later, when I talked about it, I said, "Hey, when that guy came in here with the badminton, they go, what are you talking about?" I said, "The guy with the badminton." He goes, "That wasn't a badminton racket. That was a machete." I said, "No, we argued about this for like weeks. I maintained that the guy was carrying a bad." He goes, "You have no street smarts at all. It was a machete." So now this is apropos of the situation. If you see somebody running down the street, but in the case of Greg Becker, when we get to the stuff that he's been being accused of gaslighting people on, the either the acknowledgement of the threats or weaknesses, maybe he just didn't see him. Now you say that he is at least partially culpable because it's his job to see them, right? Is that your claim?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay.
Well, and I think, but I mean, the Ezra Klein makes an interesting point in an opinion piece in the New York Times. And he
Mm,
says, part of the problem is that everything moves really quickly and we haven't
yeah.
caught up to it yet. Right.
Yeah.
And that the
Yeah.
reason that Becker and everybody else is on the back foot when it comes to understanding the impact of the way that interest rates had risen. It's happened so quickly that it completely
Yeah.
turned over. Like a lot of the financial, like the whole financial situation was switched for many banks because the Fed rose the interest, increased the interest rate so
Hmm.
quickly. But there's
Hmm.
also, one of the things that happened is so the reason that this bank run happened was that Becker
Hmm.
was on a
Hmm.
call with hundreds of lawyers and investors. And he
Hmm.
said something to the effect of, but hey, don't go telling people that SVB is in trouble because that could be a problem. And a lawyer got a transcript, copied and pasted that line, and emailed it to all of his clients. And the New York Times quoted one
Yeah.
of the guys saying, I got this piece of the transcript from my lawyer and I took out all my money. I mean, they lost $42 billion in a day. Billion with a B. And I think that's what is interesting to me is the idea that we're working at a scale and a speed that is unprecedented in human evolution, and that our systems haven't, they haven't kept up. And I think that's part of the challenge, is that there aren't, and there are people who have been saying this. This is not new. This is why there was a desire to continue to have stress tests and banks and regulation. But I think it's recognizing that we have had a fundamental change in how we do business, and that we have this lag, like we haven't caught up, right? It's like the federal government being concerned about TikTok on people's phones in the federal government. It's like, do you not know how much data is being vacuumed up about each one of us, and we're all opting in continuously? You're focusing on one thing that's small, and you're missing the larger picture.
Yep.
But so do you want to do your fire me? What's your fire me?
The fire me thing is, and it's always top of my mind, and also top of the fold in old newspaper terms, because I'm sitting literally probably half a mile from Facebook, now Meta, and so the news comes right away through the neighborhood group, the neighborhood watch thing. So it turns out that they're going to lay off 10, 11,000 more people. But if you caught my sentence construction there, they're going to. Not they haven't. They have already, but they're going to. They announce that they're going to, or it's been like a soft announcement that they're going to. And to me, this seems like, if you had a relationship, try doing that in your relationship. Say, hey, you know what? Come July, you're out. You're done. And see how the intervening months go of that relationship. It's like, I don't know. I guess it was intent. His audience in this instance, I think his audience was probably the investment community. That's who he was talking to. But but maybe the investment community hears him. Maybe they don't. They've got bigger fish to fry. That's okay. That's a hold. And not a strong buy in the investment community terms. But the people who actually are getting up every day, logging on to Zoom or walking into the building there and trying to get their jobs done, 11,000 of you are going to be gone by July. Talk about run on the banks. If I'm in that place now, I'm not hoping I'm going to be one of the people that's kept. I'm hoping I'm one of the people that can leave before the deluge of 10,999 other people are looking for jobs in the same area. So screw you, gotta go. And if this is not going to, either the companies are doing like what somebody just recently accused them of, vanity padding their employee numbers by just hiring people. There's a thing on Google, they're just hiring people that they don't need, it's like a dick measuring contest. And or these people were fundamentally really needed, and now they're scrambling for the exits because of loose lips that you have about what your plans for the investment community, like, oh dude, we're taking steps to to mitigate our losses. Okay, yeah, whatever, man, whatever. It's bad business. It's bad boss business. You don't do it. You don't do it in your personal relationship. I wouldn't suggest doing it in your professional relationship. But what do I know? I'm not beholden to the investment community, so maybe it was the right move. But it feels wrong to me. So,
but imagine if many years ago somebody had come in and said, "Okay, here's what's going to happen in the future. All of you are going to work for free to write stuff and take pictures and make content. You're going to spend a lot of time doing this to get likes. And these companies are going to take your work and make money off of it by giving your work to other people and selling all of your data. So where you go, what you look at, what you shop, all of those things, that's what we're going to monetize. So there's no real product. There's nothing that's actually being built. Talk about a swindle. Talk about the emperor's new clothes. You have people who work social media like it's their job for some kind of likes. Now, I say this as someone who is doing something on social media, but there's a level of craziness to the point where I think we've gotten used to accepting things like, okay, Facebook, which is now Meta. I mean, the reason that Zuckerberg's in so much trouble is he's spent so much money on the metaverse, which really isn't interesting anybody. So that's why
it didn't when it was second life either. So okay.
but he thought it was going to be different. All right, just a
Yeah.
couple things in case you work for a gaslighting boss who maybe isn't, imploding or bringing down the whole company, but still problematic. Here are a couple things. First, don't believe the hype. Don't get swept up in these dreams of greatness that are based on a story or narrative around one person that just doesn't sit right with you, right?
Yeah.
Beware of companies that are all about the founder or the leader. Don't invest in them. Don't go to work for them. You want to think about like a three-legged stool, right? And having a charismatic, great founder or leader with some great idea, that's wonderful. But you also need to have a company that's run effectively, that can do the job they set out to do, right? In this case, like you manage risk because you are a bank. So you need to have that. And then I think the third leg of the stool is something that's outside of the PR machine and the hype, right? I mean, we all know of startups that have come in and said, this is what we're going to do. And they've made some stuff up. So I think if you're looking at investing in or working for a company with this sort of like boss that's out there carrying the banner of whatever, make sure that there's some fundamentals underneath that so you don't get in trouble. Second, make sure that the fundamentals are handled. So when the class of 22 interns showed up at the SVB offices in New York City, there were mice running across the floor and the AC didn't work.
Oh man.
Now, if I'm taking this as like something that's supposed to further my career, I'm going to look at that. I'm going to look at the fact that like if a bank that's that big with that many assets can't manage rodents in their office, there's probably some other problems. There used to be a few years ago, there was a management theory that talked about the broken window.
Yeah.
If there's a broken window in a company and it's not fixed, it means that there's something wrong with how the company manages itself. Right. And I think looking at some of these fundamentals, looking at some of these broken windows and believing them. And that brings me to the third one, which is really believe yourself. Believe your eyes, believe your understanding of your own industry. It's easy to look on some of these people who were part of these long-term cons, like Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, people who worked for her. And you wonder, how did they not see that this was all a house of cards? How did they not understand?
Eugene Robinson at Aussie Media.
Well, I wasn't going to go there, but how do people not understand, right? And I think that it's because we get so invested in our job. And when we become invested, we want it to be true. Like I would suggest that you wanted it to be true. You wanted it to be real.
I maintained at the time, I said, if 80% of what he said is true, because journalists have that whole saying, if your mother says she loves you, you get a second opinion, right? So, if 80% of what he said was true, I figured I was fine. And then I have a 50% rule of lying. Most people don't lie by more than 50%. How many apples did you take? Well, I took 4. Well, okay, that means you probably took 8. But nobody would say, nobody lies by more than 50%. That's just my unofficial life thing, right? So, but of course, when you meet, face forward to a real grifter, of course, 50%. Why stop there? I'm going to lie by way more than that. So that's what you're never prepared for, because you just the audacity, you don't expect it, and that's the whole, I think, at the heart of gaslighting, that somebody would turn the lights off and say, no, the lights are fine. You just don't expect it, right?
Well, and I think also, I mean, I have been in situations where I have spoken to gaslighting bosses and told them very clearly what you are saying is not true. And the amount of rage that comes at me is daunting. And I understand why people don't do that. I understand why people don't say, because, some of these people who are in these positions, they're so invested in, they have bought their own narrative. They have bought their own PR, and they can have this rage. And I think that's part of why gaslighting is so often used in talking about interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships, or marriages. They talk about it as a dynamic that's used in intimate relationships because so often it's associated with a level of rage that you don't usually see in the professional world. And I have seen it. And I think when you challenge someone's notion of who they are, right? Someone who thinks that the time-space continuum doesn't apply to them, they can turn on you and they can be really angry. And so that's the last thing that I would suggest to anybody that is working for a gaslighting boss is be careful when you challenge them, but challenge them.
But I have a vignette. A media person, a person who you would have known if you were into music in the 80s started a company. His name was Thomas Dolby. And Thomas Dolby started a company called Beatnik. And I interviewed there right after I was at Apple, but before I went to Adobe. And they wanted to make me director of marketing or some very, it would have been the biggest title jump that I'd ever had heretofore. The money wasn't significant, but stock options were pretty major. It was a company that was about to go public, purportedly. And my boss, who had been my boss at Apple, had gone there. So all of the signs that this was a place that I should go. And I turned the job down, much to my wife at the time's anger and consternation that I did turn this job down. And I said, I got a feeling. I got a feeling. But mostly the feeling came when I said, what kind of budget exists to publicize the fact that Beatnik is doing all of these cool kind of things? And the woman interviewing me, a vice president of the company, said, we don't have a budget. We are primarily relying on the celebrity of our CEO. So for those of you who don't recall who Thomas Dolby is, his hit was "She Blinded Me with Science," and there was one other song, and that was a point at which I decided, nah, nah, can't work here. The company now is it's a dialysis center.
Wow.
So, they're out of business as far as, well, they're not in the same building. I was just by there the other day. It is now a dialysis center. So I think I made the right call there. Adobe still exists. So,
Well, and I think that's where you can see the crack, right? Is often if it's talking about finances, because that's where I would, when I did confront these type of people, it would be on finances. I was told that they could do X, Y, and Z for a certain amount of money. And I'm like, I know from my own experience that that is an order of magnitude too little, and was told that I was wrong. And so I think that is something to think about if you're working for a gaslighting boss. You can't argue sometimes with the money, and that can be a good way in. All right, we're almost to our time. So I don't know what our next show is going to be about, but I would love to get some suggestions from the audience. We're getting more people who are subscribing, but not a lot that are writing in. So tell me what we should do 2 weeks from now. Email us at WTF@badbossbrief.com. That's WTF@badbossbrief.com. I promise I read every single one, and give us some suggestions, and we will incorporate it, and see you next time. Thanks, everybody.
Adios.
Thank you for listening to the Bad Boss Brief with your hosts, Eugene S. Robinson and Stephanie Peirolo. You can check out more of their work by visiting consigliera.substack.com for Stephanie and eugenesrobinson.substack.com for Eugene. You can also find Eugene at Mr. Sleep 3, that's the number 3, on Instagram. Send us your questions or comments to WTF@badbossbrief.com, and be sure to join us right here on your favorite podcast platform for more insights every other week. Until next time, don't be an asshole at work.